and it is now my pleasure to welcome Lessons from Cuba, Women on the Front Lines, Establishing Democracy.
Thank you, Darian. And my name is Cindy Domingo. I'm the co-chair of WILPF's Cuba and the Bolivarian Alliance Issues Committee, as well as the chair of U.S. Women in Cuba Collaboration. I want to welcome you here today, and thank you so much for the organizers of this Congress. It is one of the best Congresses I've been. All of the issues are intersected. And in particular, when we begin to talk about Cuba, I want to repeat Vandana Shiva's assertion that a better world is possible as long as we work for the betterment of society and not for profit or privatization. Reverend Theo Harris's reminder from the Poor People's Campaign that a better world is possible, but in the United States, we have 53 cents of every dollar spent on the military, while we have 15 cents on anti-poverty programs. When people say that Cuba is a failed society, we have to look at, do Cubans have free healthcare? Do they have free education all the way to college? And yes, they do, even though they're going through great difficulties today. So our panel, Women on the Front Lines, Establishing Democracy, is very honored today to have with us Cuban Ambassador to the United States, Lianes Torres Rivera. When we first conceptualized this panel, we wanted to focus on how Cuba was constructing its democracy specific to its population and history, and especially the role that Cuban women have played in the construction of their society. But since then, Cuba has been in the headlines over the last month, and because of that coverage by our media, we wanted to take the time to discuss current day events, and most of all, to hear from the ambassador what is transpiring in Cuba and the economic crisis that is impacting Cuba and the causes of that economic crisis. We hope that this session will begin to help answer your questions, give you a deeper analysis of what is transpiring and the history to it, and just as important, what you can do to combat the misinformation that is being perpetuated by the corporate-controlled media, by conservative Cuban Americans, and even by our Congress members. Towards the end of this panel, we will give you concrete ways that we can hold the Biden administration accountable to the promises that Biden made on his presidential campaign, which is to move towards normalization of relations between our two countries. At the same time, we also wanted to talk about how Cuba has used its commitment to healthcare as a human right as a cornerstone to democracy, which Lenny Villagomez-Reeves will do. And lastly, Catherine Hall Trujillo will speak to why we owe Cuba our support and what we have learned from Cuba. So because I have already outlined our program for you, I will introduce our speakers first all together, and then they can begin. So because I have already, Lenny Villagomez is my co-chair of WILPF's Cuba and the Bolivarian Alliance Issues Committee. She got her beginnings as an activist, as an organizer with Dolores Huerta and the United Farm Workers, and eventually went to medical school and is now a retired ER doctor. She is in leadership of the Fresno WILPF chapter and is an active member of the Saving Lives campaign that focuses on the role Cuba plays in the battle against COVID-19 pandemic. Catherine Hall Trujillo is the founder of the Birthing Project USA, adjunct faculty with the Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science Urban Public Health Program, an independent scholar of the Cuban healthcare system, and has brought knowledge and training to women and about maternal health and infancy care and has brought that knowledge to the largest medical school in the world, free medical school located in Cuba called the Latin American School of Medicine. So I'd like to first begin with the ambassador to the United States from Cuba. And we are very honored to have Ambassador Torres with us today. And thank you for taking the time to addressing WILPF's Congress. Please.
Well, thank you, Cindy, and good afternoon for all the participants today. I would like to start by thanking the invitation received by the National Committee of U.S. Women and Cuba collaboration. It is my pleasure to share with you today some ideas about the current situation in Cuba, as Cindy explained before. First, I'd like to talk about what is happening in Cuba now, and how is the current situation, which is difficult. After handling well the COVID-19 pandemic, the Delta variant got to Cuba, and we have experienced since then a spike of cases and sadly a spike of death people too. For example, yesterday we have 8,816 positive cases, which made a total of more than 500,000 cases since the beginning of the pandemic. We, of course, we regret the death yesterday of 83 people. The Cuban government is allocated most of its limited resources to fight the pandemic, and proof of that is the creation of 100% national vaccine candidates. One of which is already a vaccine, Abdala, as you might heard, and there is an ongoing sanitary intervention with Soberana O2. By the way, I have Soberana O2, and I'm very proud to say that many women are involved and has been involved in all the vaccine development projects and lead some of them. Anyway, the very difficult situation generated by the pandemic has been worsened by more than 240 measures taken by the US government with the intention of strangling even more the Cuban economy, which has led to power cuts and shortage of food, medicines, oil, and other products of first necessity. Taking advantage of this situation, a brutal political and media campaign is underway against Cuba to create chaos, and we could say a situation that could justify more aggressive measures against my country. After a few days of boosting the mentioned campaign in social network, on July 11th, they provoked some protests inside the country, which swiftly evolved from criticizing the scarcity to violent events, then demanding to overthrow our government. These events have been followed by the most aggressive campaign, as I said, I ever seen against a small country like Cuba. Big media, US government officials, congressperson, tech companies, and the right-wing anti-Cuba movement have worked together to spread misinformation about the situation in Cuba. But what really happened in Cuba was an attempt to subvert the institutional order that was defeated swiftly by our people, the one who went to the street to defend the revolution some days before. In recent days, the Cuban Foreign Ministry, the Cuban Foreign Ministry, Bruno Rodriguez, you probably heard him, has exposed the US government's maneuver to press some European and Latin American countries to condemn Cuba and to amplify the lies and false information they are spreading about our country. But the truth is that we have received the support of governments and people from all around the world. including people like you and here today who know the work of the revolution and know the cruelty of the sanctions that the US government has imposed against our people for more than 60 years now. The lies are weaker every day. The US government is trying to solve that their sanctions help the Cuban people. Even when 2 months ago, 184 countries voted against the blockade at the UN General Assembly. Even when the last administration imposed new sanctions during the pandemic to make the situation more difficult for ordinary Cubans, when it is very difficult and haphazard to send aid to Cuba because of the blockade, and when the declared goal of the sanctions are to surrender the Cuban people by hunger and scarcity. The economic difficulties that the blockade imposed affect, as you know, all areas of the Cuban society: health, food, medicine production and import, commerce, education, everything. But this situation has been distorted and manipulated to create the illusion of opposition groups, a very rude attempt to portray that there is a chaos and lack of governance in Cuba, and even to say we are, as Cindy was mentioning before, a failed state. All of that to call for a humanitarian intervention that is not anything but for us a military intervention. The US have consistently spent money in the so-called programs to promote democracy in Cuba. And the same people who have received that money through years are those fabricating and disturbing lies against Cuba. And in the other hand, they are criticizing the Democratic administration for being soft with Cuba. It seems once more that the policy towards Cuba is not a foreign policy issue, but a domestic one. But I have to tell you that Cuba is in calm, and its government, our government, keeps working hard for the improvement of our people's daily life. The vaccination process keeps going forward. More than 2.5 million people are fully vaccinated, around 23% of the population, and 31.3% has one dose already. The updating, on the other hand, the updating of our economic and social model hasn't stopped. Just recently, we approved a law decree to regulate the micro, small, and medium enterprises. We have incentivized the imports of clean energy components. We have continued to develop the e-commerce. We have eliminated the restriction related to the non-agricultural cooperative. We have further developed the self-employment, and we have updated the social security regime for self-employees. As you might see, despite all the obstacles imposed by the COVID-19 pandemic, blockade, and the continued lies and attacks against us, our revolution is still committed against us. Our revolution is still committed to the principle that we inherited from our Comandante en Jefe Fidel. And we will continue working to build a better country for every Cuban. I can tell you that for sure. So those are the thoughts that I wanted to share with you today briefly. And I want to thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you always for coming to join us on our conversations. We are going to try to have Q&A at the end, but if you could hold your questions until that section begins so that we're not distracted in the chat. And so now I'd like to introduce Lenny Villagomez-Reeves, the co-chair of our committee. Welcome, Lenny.
Hi, I'm Lenny Villagomez-Reeves, co-chair of the Cuban and the Bolivarian Alliance Committee of WILPF and active in the Fresno branch. I spend a fair amount of time in Cuba each year in a normal year. And so I thought rather than staring at my face, you might like to see some Cuban women on the front line. And I will try to set that up right now. Yeah, Cuba's healthcare system, biotech sector, and international medical solidarity are remarkable. Unique would not be too strong a word because so is Cuba. I've been going to Cuba several times a year for many years now. I speak Spanish because Mexico is part of my mixed ancestry, and so I spend a fair amount of time in Cuba each year in a normal year. Mostly on my own, but also with Pastors for Peace. And I picked up some info and I stay in touch with people there. Cuba is profoundly different. And the more you know, the more different it appears. Also, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. It's a moving, changing, highly nuanced reality. It's a place where safety and education and health and opportunity don't depend on how much money you have, where every pregnant woman has the best prenatal care. Cuba tries to put the compromiso social, the social commitment or commitment to the people first. They guarantee the right to healthcare and education. All of the children go to school, clothed, fed, immunized, and with shoes on their feet. There are millions of working children in the world, and none of them are Cuban. This is the only third world or Latin American country that's developed their own vaccines. Cuba was the first country in the world to eliminate mother-to-child HIV and syphilis transmission, the first country in the world to eliminate polio, the first country to sign the UN Declaration on the Rights of Women, the first country in the whole Western Hemisphere to legalize abortion. Cuba is a revolutionary place that does not deny history. It's a country that makes mistakes and corrects them, a living experiment in making a new and different model of society. Other countries, especially in Latin America, look to Cuba as an example. In the US, here's that example. Let's talk about the healthcare system. I'm a pediatric emergency physician, by the way. In Cuba, healthcare is a human right. Access doesn't depend on money. Survival rates for cancer don't depend on income and insurance, as they do in the US. You can look that up. In 1959, when the revolution triumphed, Cuba had about 6,000 doctors concentrated in urban areas, about 3,000 left. Now there are 85,000 doctors. In 1959, the infant mortality rate was 37.3 per 1,000 live births, and that statistic hides a huge rural-urban disparity. Now it is 4.3, which is better than the US rate of 5.8, which also hides a huge disparity that in the US, the rate for Black infants is 11.3 per 1,000 live births. There was only one rural hospital in Cuba when the revolution triumphed, and now there are 64. Cuba spends, though, only between 7 and 10% of its gross domestic product on healthcare in a non-pandemic year. It's not just about more doctors or more money spent. This is a system that recognizes healthcare as a right and organizes to make that real. Over the years, the model has evolved to the integrated system now in place. The basis is the MHE, the family practitioner, 13,000 of them, who live in and operate local family practice offices, each caring for between 1,000 and 1,500 people in their community. Polyclinics are the backup, offering specialty services and additional public health services. Next level are the more than 150 community hospitals, and the tertiary level is provided by 12 institutes that give highly specialized care and do research. Cuban system is universal, guarantees access, they take a preventive approach, and this is important, you can't look at things in isolation. Cuba is free of illiteracy. Prevention is better in every way, humanly and also economically. And Cuba's success demonstrates that universal access and universal health coverage are feasible and indeed are absolutely key to success in improving people's health. There are problems and shortages. For a small third world country to offer free universal health care is a big challenge, even without the pandemic. Many of the shortages, most, are effects of the US blockade, which prohibits trade with Cuba with the penalty of seizure of a company's US assets. Any company, anywhere in the world, if it has a US affiliate, can be prevented from trading with Cuba, and that includes pharmaceutical companies. Any medical device with any component made by a company with a US affiliate can be prohibited to be sold to Cuba. Blockades prevents medicines, including antibiotics, pain meds, chemo drugs, equipment, including pacemakers, heart valves, surgical tools, MRI machines, ventilators, PPE, and even medical books from being traded freely to Cuba. I don't like feeling responsible for a policy this cruel and immoral. In 1959, there was one medical school in Cuba, and now there are 21 for Cubans, and also the Latin American School of Medicine, which exists to train doctors from other countries. It now has thousands of students from over 90 countries studying medicine with the pledge to return home to serve the medical needs of the poor people in their own countries. And there are students and graduates from the US also. Cuba lets us know what solidarity really is. It's sharing what you have, not what's left over. Cuba's international medical solidarity did not just begin during the pandemic. Cuba's medical mission started in Chile in 1960, shortly after the triumph of the revolution. In the 70s and 80s, Cuban doctors worked in countries in wartime Africa, including South Africa, Algeria, Zaire, Congo, and Ghana. In 2005, the international contingent of doctors specialized in disaster situations and serious epidemics, Henry Reeve, was created with medical volunteers who offered to come to the US at that point to help victims of Hurricane Katrina. Bush turned them down, of course. In these 15 years, over 14,000 Cuban healthcare workers have cared for over 4 million patients in 53 countries in disaster situations and epidemics, notably the Ebola epidemic in West Africa and the cholera epidemic in Haiti. During the present pandemic, the Henry Reeve contingent has so far sent 53 brigades to 39 countries and territories at the request of their government. More than 3,800 Cuban health professionals, 61.2% of whom are women, are participating in this unprecedented effort. This is not, by the way, but Cuban women comprise more than half of the medical professionals, of the research scientists, of the administrators, and indeed of the Cuban parliament. Cuba has developed 2 vaccines against COVID-19 that have been approved for use after extensive testing. Another 3, including one for nasal use, are still in the clinical trials process. Cuba can do this because Cuba has a robust, innovative, advanced biotechnology sector, despite 6 decades of US blockade. Cuba's biotech sector is unique, with the national health system as its first priority, an orientation toward global South-South cooperation. It's entirely owned and financed by the Cuban people, not speculative capital, so it responds to the needs of the Cuban people and not to profit motives, and it's based on cooperation and collaboration and not, on competition. And it has an emphasis on screening and prevention of disease. This model has worked. Cuba has developed some innovative medicines and vaccines, including the world's first meningococcus vaccine, a treatment for a type of lung cancer, a medication to treat diabetic foot ulcers that dramatically reduces the need for amputation, and medicines that have been used to treat COVID-19 with good results. People go to Cuba and they forget to wonder why there are no tropical diseases there. It turns out there are no tropical diseases. There are only diseases of poverty. The free, universally accessible, community-based healthcare system has transformed the country. And the biotech scientists have certainly made their contribution, which is going to be essential now as a mass vaccination campaign is underway. Cubans may say not a moment too soon. Although Cuba had very few COVID-19 infections during most of 2020 after the borders were reopened, the numbers began to climb, although they are nowhere near the numbers of infections in most of the US. In Miami-Dade County, Florida, for example, which has 1/4 of the population of Cuba, they have had 4 times as many COVID-19 deaths. The Cuban vaccine Abdala works at over 92% efficiency. It's approved for use, and the president of Cuba is affirming the decision of the Cuban people to continue their medical solidarity, already strongly expressed in the medical brigades in the Latin American School of Medicine, by extending access to the Cuban vaccines to countries that can't afford the vaccines developed by the world's great powers. Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel said this will be good for the more than 11 million Cubans, and also for millions of people in the world, above all, those who are poorest, who have no access to any of the other vaccines. So if you require perfection, Cuba will disappoint you. But if you want to see how people in the real world work out the processes of creating something new and different, you may be profoundly excited and also moved by the courage and work it takes to do this. There's no dry lab for experiments in building a new world. You have to do it in real time among living people, and not everything turns out right. But enough has worked out well in Cuba to scare the pants off the US, where they want us to believe that merciless racial capitalism, vicious competition among people, mindless exploitation of the environment, and the subjugation of people's needs to the money hunger of international corporate interests, the police shooting people in their homes and in the streets, that this is the only inevitable way to live. It isn't, and Cuba can prove that. Cuba lets us know it's possible to do things differently. Free universal health care, education, elimination of structural racism, no child labor, environmental sustainability, international cooperation and solidarity on the side of the oppressed. These are not only dreams and fantasies, they're real in the world today. Cuba's envisioned a more just society, and they're working to carry this out with imperfections, very true. And in spite of obstacles, by far the largest of which is the US economic blockade of the country. So go see for yourself when you can. When the pandemic ends, the best thing to do is go and find out. The travel ban included with the sanctions is intended to limit or prevent this, but various groups travel to Cuba legally and some as challenges to the blockade laws. You will be amazed at how much reality differs from the corporate media version. Why do you suppose that is? Thank you.
Thank you, Lenny. You know, tragedies always have a silver lining, and one of the silver linings of this pandemic brought Lenny to us, and she's been a wonderful addition to our WILPF Issues Committee. And if you're looking for a speaker on Cuba, you can find no one more knowledgeable than Lenny. So thank you for your presentation. And now I'd like to introduce Catherine Hall Trujillo, who also just began working with our committees, and a longtime solidarity activist with Cuba, and so knowledgeable about maternal health and infancy care. So Catherine, please.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to say a special thank you to the ambassador. Every time I'm in your presence, I just want to make sure that you know how much I appreciate not only what you're doing to model to the world the possibility of what a better world could look like, but that you represent what the people of Cuba are doing as well. So thank you. As I was listening to Lenny, I actually was trying to figure out how to change my presentation because hers were so comprehensive. And so I will basically say that today I'm representing Birthing Project USA, which is a global maternal and child health organization. We're in about 13 countries globally. And IFCO Pastors for Peace, where I serve as a member of the Cuba US Medical School Scholarship Program Advisory Committee. and as an ambassador for FIRE, which is the Federation of Gender and Human Rights, a UN recognized entity. So what I'm going to do to bring a little bit of depth to Lenny's presentation is to talk about what I've been doing the last 20 years in Cuba on the ground, working with both the medical school project and working with INSAP, Cuba's National School of Public Health, and the impact of that relationship between those two Cuban entities, what the impact of working with them collaterally has, how it has affected the United States. And so first I want to talk about the medical school program. Many of you know that 21 years ago, when the Congressional Black Caucus was visiting Cuba and saw the healthcare system, they asked Cuba if they would send doctors to the United States, especially to Mississippi. At this point, President Clinton was leaving office, and he basically said, no, we could not have Cuban doctors coming to the United States to provide healthcare because that would look like we needed help. A few months later, Fidel was in New York, and the Congressional Black Caucus was at the meeting where he was speaking and basically said, we do need help. And Fidel, being the very special person that he was, and always quick to respond to what the problem really is, said, well, we're opening a medical school, the Latin American School of Medicine, basically to deal with the systemic issues of developing countries not having enough physicians to take care of their population. As you well know, when something happens, the Cubans are the first ones there to provide medical care around the world. And so the systemic issue was to open a school, which turned out to be an old military base that now is the medical school for Latin America and for Africa and for the Middle East, where we have students there from about 105 countries at any one given time who are there because they want to be doctors and go home to where they came from and provide medical care. And so he provided the United States 500 scholarships. I'm happy to tell you that as of last week, where 12 more graduated, we now have approximately 220 world-recognized physicians in the United States who are either practicing medicine or going through the process of being in residency or taking the US required tests to enter residency program. And I am not disappointed in any of them, because without having all kinds of paperwork to swear that once you get this education, you will come back and work in underserved areas, we have been able to identify students to attend ELAM who have this in their heart and their mind, and they want to do this, and they do this, and they do this well. One of the reasons I was so interested in the medical school is that my organization had the only clinic in the United States that was grassroots, community-based, people of color doing maternal health. And although students love to volunteer at our clinic, as they left, they always promised, as soon as I become a real doctor, I'm going to come back here and work. But when students go to medical school in the US, not only do they get a certificate of completion, they get a bill for at least $350,000 to repay the loans they have received to get this magnificent education. And so those students who promised they would come back and work for us were not able to come back and work for us because we could not afford to pay them. But because of Cuba and the medical school program, we now have an international medical director at our organization, Birthing Project USA, because she was one of those recipients. We also have a project in Tallahassee, Florida, and we have a project starting in the Bronx in New York that are started by those same ELAM trained physicians. one of the things that we realized is that more than having doctors, we needed to look at the healthcare system that the US has. And I was specifically interested in the fact that if Black people in the United States were a nation, we would rank as probably number 76 in terms of keeping our babies alive. I just looked at the CIA report, fact book that was released today, and it shows that not only do we rank behind every developing country in the world, we rank behind Cuba and several other countries in terms of keeping our babies alive. So when I asked the Ministry of Health if they would help us look at Black infant mortality and morbidity in the US, they said yes, opened the doors, and gave me an opportunity for the last 7 years to facilitate in-depth on-site immersion course at the Cuba National School of Public Health, which educates some of our best policymakers in the US, providers, health and human service providers, to look at the system that Cuba has in terms of how we can make a system that's accessible, both in terms of it exists and people can afford to pay for it. And so Cuba has presented a great opportunity to us at every level. And I feel that what Cuba is helping us do through the work that I am doing on the ground is to answer the question that Fidel said the Western Hemisphere had to deal with if it was to survive. And what I heard him say out of his own mouth is that one of the most critical questions in this day and age is, what is the Western Hemisphere going to do with all the Africans they brought here and now they don't have a need for? And what Cuba is demonstrating is how to create a society that is equitable and inclusive and provides the very basic things people need in order to be successful citizens in the society where they live. And the final thing I would like to say is that Fidel also said to the US students when they asked why they were allowed to be a part of this magnificent Latin American School of Medicine. And what Fidel said is that the US needs to learn solidarity. And I will say, as a Black woman who feels that I didn't have a home, Cuba has become my home. As a Black woman who felt I did not belong, I feel that when I look at Cindy Domingo, when I look at Jan Stroud, when I look at Lindy Reeves, when I look at women who are not in my usual circle of friends and family, I see women that I will stand side by side with and fight for Cuba, because this is something that means survival for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. We do have a wonderful group of women and a collaboration between WILPF's Issues Committee and US Women in Cuba collaboration. And we have one man, Philip, who has joined us, and some of the people from the Fannie Lou Hamer branch. And so we are continuing to expand our work, and we hope that you, if you're interested, will join our Issues Committee. And it is more important even now. This is a crucial period, as Catherine said, for the movement in solidarity with Cuba. We have to show that Cuba is not alone, that we are here. And WILPF has been here for Cuba. WILPF has stood against the blockade for decades. And we have asserted that it is the Cuban people's right to self-determination, to determine their own future and what path they will take. And the United States should not intervene. I'm so glad to see that Odell and others are forming a US feminist US foreign policy committee in which we hope to enjoin our Cuba issues work with it, because we think that women and a feminist US foreign policy is the key to turning our policy around for one that cares about people around the world rather than using our military might to attack them. As I said, this is a crucial period for our movement. And over the last 16 months, the largest and broadest coalition working to organize the lifting of the blockade has been formed. A collaboration between Canada and the United States in the formation of the International US-Cuba Normalization Conference Coalition. And even really important is a growing Cuban American movement wanting to go back and to hold Biden accountable when he said he would go back at least to the Obama era Cuba policy, especially in this pandemic. This is important so that Cuban Americans and others will be able to send money, visit their family, and a movement called Bridges of Love, Puentes de Amor, has been formed. And recently, a delegation of Cuban Americans walked 1,300 miles from Miami to Washington, D.C. to deliver that message that they want to form bridges of love and to support the Cuban families in Cuba. And you can very concretely help the Cuban people. Recently, over the last few months, we have been doing a syringes campaign. Syringes are like PPE was back last year, where there was no PPE. And now that the United States and other developed countries are vaccinating their population, syringes are at a high premium. And so we in the United States and in Canada, well, this was in the United States, we raised almost $600,000 in solidarity with Cuba to send 6 million syringes. And given the international campaign and what we've done in the United States, Cuba will probably have enough syringes to vaccinate its entire population. And as Lenny said, they are moving very quickly towards that goal of vaccinating Havana, and then the rest of the country will be vaccinated, hopefully by the end of this year. We are going to expand the syringes campaign to provide PPE, and we are embarking on raising money. The PPE is already in hand, and we are raising money to send that PPE to protect those essential workers, especially the healthcare workers, just like we did here in this country. And it will help stem the spread of the pandemic with the PPE. We are also expanding our campaign to raise money so that we can purchase other medical supplies and additives that can be used, medical additives and ingredients, so that Cuba can continue to make the vaccines that will help its populations, but also after their country is vaccinated and they are able to reopen their borders for tourism so they can get hard currency, they will expand to other countries, developing countries around the world. And we know that Africa is already slated to be the last continent to be vaccinated. And we know also that Cuba will be there to help vaccinate the African nations. We want to expand the campaign to help Cuba focused on women and girls, and focused on buying and sending feminine hygiene products, birth control, materials and equipment for women after they deliver babies. And if you are interested in joining this campaign, raising money, finding products, we hope you'll join us. We all know as women what it feels like, or well, we don't know because in this country we're fairly privileged, but to be without feminine hygiene products. That is the difficulty that women and girls face in Cuba. We want you also to reach out to your senator or members of Congress and urge them to co-sponsor pending bills that are before Congress right now. 2 of them which are focused on essentially lifting the entire blockade. There's a House Bill 3625 introduced by Representative Bobby Rush from Chicago, which is called the US-Cuba Relations Normalization Act. And there's also a companion bill, S-249, introduced by Senator Wyden, which also advocates for, which put into law lifting the blockade. We hope that you can lobby your congresspeople to co-sponsor those two bills. And Senator Klobuchar, short of lifting the blockade, is sponsoring Senate Bill 1694, the Freedom to Export to Cuba Act of 2021. And those bills are listed on our WILPF US website under our Cuba campaign. And we want you to write to Biden. Biden recently, because of the upsurge of activity within the Cuban right wing and conservative communities, has only harshened the blockade instead of going back to what he promised during his campaign. So we want you to write to Biden and tell him, keep his promise, move towards normalization. Whether you agree with how Cubans are organizing their society, lifting the blockade is a humanitarian measure. It doesn't have to be political. It is a humanitarian measure, especially in this period of the pandemic. And educate yourselves. Look for alternative media for coverage on Cuba. Look to Democracy Now!, Al Jazeera English, and our Facebook pages on WILPF US, as well as US Women in Cuba collaboration, and the website to the US-Cuba-Normalization.org and the National Network on Cuba. You have to look for your own sources, the alternative sources, and not depend on the corporate controlled media that is funded by the United States to spread misinformation and lies. And lastly, as Lenny said, travel to Cuba. Once Cuba opens its border, hopefully by the end of this year, there will be opportunities to travel to Cuba, see for yourself, and see how a better world is being constructed, as Vandana Shiva talked about to us. And lastly, remember, it's important that we raise our voices to show that Cuba is not alone and that we don't agree with Biden's US foreign policy. And we agree that the Cubans deserve the future determined by their own self-determination. So if you have any questions, we have 12 minutes. So if you could put them in the chat, we have 5 minutes according to Darian. So I think we're going to spotlight all the speakers. And if you have questions, there was a question early on by Elaine Nooneman about what are the risks of US military response to the earthquake in Haiti and other countries impacted in the region? So the risk of US military response. Does anybody want to address that issue?
I think that we all know what happens when the US military intervenes in the country. It's done it in Haiti before, and the response was abuse of the population of the country and a cholera pandemic. US military intervention has never helped a single country in my lifetime, maybe sometime in the far distant past.
Military intervention is never the answer. Never the answer. Solidarity is the answer. The work that you do.
Yes, and we should keep in mind that the people who are calling for direct US military intervention are not the Cubans in Cuba, but some of those in Miami. So whose interests are being served by those demands? It is not the Cubans themselves. The Cubans may have been voicing concerns over the economic conditions in Cuba. They they are not asking for direct military intervention. They understand what that would mean. Let's see. There is a question from Odile. I heard people are really hungry. They're due to boycott, food lacking, etc.
I'd like to do a part of the answer to that question.
Okay, go ahead, Kath.
One of the things that I have found very fascinating with Cuba, and this is because of my relationship with Pastors for Peace, is that we get an opportunity to see the behind the scenes of how Cuba works. In terms of the closest we get in our society, or with I work with students, I'm a professor, of how you actually put together a country is from Hamilton. Cuba is only 60 years old. And so I have been very fascinated by Cubans trying to figure out, for example, how do we tax people? If everybody has a place where they live, but someone can rent their homes out to tourists, should they pay tax? And how much should that tax be? And whatever. And so at our end, we don't get to, we haven't figured out where all these laws come from and how they're thought through. But from their end of being 60 years old, and also people who are my age, I'm 70 something, who are 70 something and older, they're the ones who fought for the revolution and are still living. But in answer to the question around hunger and food, I'm privy to see how Cuba is handling the distribution of the limited amount of food they have. And so, for example, people who work all day, a doctor, and it doesn't have the ability to stand in line and get food for someone who has the ability to stand in line and get food. So one of the things you have to think about is how do you actually distribute food fairly? But also they take it a step further in terms of if you are hypertensive like I am, for example, and you should not be eating red meat, it's like who gets the fish first? And so it's all of these little things that go into actually planning how you distribute the limited amounts of food that they do have, so that we can say for a fact that it's a lie when people say people are starving in the streets and actually dying from starvation. No one is starving in the streets, but people may get sick of eating the same thing all the time, but people are eating.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Catherine. Oh, okay. Can you unmute the ambassador, Amy?
Yeah, there's a question about doctors in Haiti. Well, all of us heard the news in the morning about the earthquake in that country. And we have doctors there. There's a medical brigade in Haiti. And where I was watching our news at 1 p.m. and primarily they said that our doctors are starting to take care of the Haitian people who has been hurt by the earthquake. So they are already on the ground taking care of the Haitian people, of the patients that they have now. So that is what we do.
Yes, that's what you do.
Cindy, you're muted. Please
I put in the
unmute.
chat the website for Puentes de Amor. Someone asked about, Ms. Mary, asked about the people in Miami and how we can reach the young people. And part of how Miami, as well as other parts of the country, are trying to draw in young people and other new people into our movement is we have been having caravans every Sunday at the end of the month. And Miami's went from being a very small to almost 300 people in June. and is continuing to expand to show that the Cuban American community, especially in Florida, is not of one mind. And so if you are interested in joining the caravans, you can go on the National Network of Cuba website, and they list every month the different caravans in probably over more than 10 cities. And you can also initiate your own. It doesn't have to be large. It can be a few people in a caravan or a few people standing on the corner to let our Congress people know that Cuba does not stand alone. The other thing people can do is they can pass a resolution in their city council. We have a local resolutions committee out of the US-Cuba Normalization Group that has passed resolutions representing millions of people in various jurisdictions as well as organizations. And I see from Darian, and she says, and that's it. I want to thank our panelists, especially the ambassador, for joining us today, and Catherine and Lenny, and thank you to Will for hosting our panel. Thank you.